Ladies and gentlemen, like to take a seat, please. Just a few announcements before the talk starts. The annual picnic punt and plunge will take place on April the 26th. London Hat Walk is the next day, the 27th. The date has been set for the Chap Grand Flaneur Walk. It's now Sunday, May the 11th. The new edition of Resign is now available both online and by subscription.
Resign!
So thank you very much to Giles and to Tim for producing it.
Well done, Doctor.
Now resign.
The next club night is the Wednesday, the April the 2nd, where Eugenie Rhodes will deliver a talk entitled From Hero to Zero, The Dramatic Life of Oscar Wilde. Ooh. And now for tonight's talk, very pleased to welcome Laura and Tim, who will talk on Sax Fashion. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to listen to us. So this evening, it was going to be Sax and Fashion, but of course I wanted to put a little sexy spin on it, being that you are going to be treated to sampling some real live saxophone music, and I'm sure you'll agree that the saxophone is the sexiest instrument going. So, don't you? So yes, there's going to be a little spin on the, and I'm also very aware that you would all know about the history of fashion. So hopefully you might hear about something that you don't already know. We're going to try and keep it to under an hour. We're going to talk about who we are and what we'll be discussing, and I'm going to let Tim introduce himself. Oh, shall we talk about how we met, darling?
Yeah, so it might be good start. So good evening. For those of you who don't know us, because we're quite new to the club, I'm Tim. I'm a professional saxophonist. And for 39 years, I served with the next slide. Come on. Sorry, it's slick. So I was with the Scots Guards for most of that, and then on the horseback of the Blues and Royals for the last. I don't want to think about it, but the whole career added up to about 39 years. On that stage, I kind of had enough of it, to be honest. So I left. So since then, I've been scraping together a living playing sax and teaching, and so when Laura and I met at the Chap Ball, for those of you who don't know. Yeah. So we realised straight away that we had a lot of things in common. Amongst them were music and a love of clothes. So obviously, when Clayton told us that we had volunteered to talk tonight, it seemed a pretty natural choice to try and merge the two things together. So that's how we got to tonight. So. Laura, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I should introduce myself. So I'm Laura, and I am a women's sensual style coach, which means that I help them unearth their sensual nature and express that via their dress. And I also moonlight as a burlesque performer at times. So yes, it's not unlike me to put a little naughty spin on the fashion side of things.
And I'm a very happy man.
Lucky man. So, Tim, I think you're going to...
Yeah, there's a couple of notices. Yes. So I think the first one to say is if there is an emergency tonight, which is obviously unlikely, all we'd ask is that you stay seated just long enough for us to get out of the building. If there is a fire, there will be an alarm sounded. It will sound something like this. That will only ever be played. Thank you. Thank you. Good night. If you have any questions throughout any of this, please feel free to put your hand up, and we will ignore them. Don't feel, because we've been to talks before, and we thought it's something I really want to ask, but you have to try and remember it to the end, which by that time you've forgotten. So if you have any questions, keep them to yourself. No, put your hand up and ask, and we will do our best to answer.
Indeed.
So, shall we crack on?
You're going to discuss the beginning, the birth
Yeah,
of the
okay.
saxophone.
So,
But before the saxophones.
before the saxophone. So, for the start of this, I want to take you back to the 30s, okay, where a young chap called Adolf had a dream. Luckily, it was the 1830s, and it wasn't that Adolf. So this was Adolf Sax. Okay, Adolf Sax had a dream. Okay, it was a bit bonkers at the time. Bearing in mind, this is what music sounded like before the sax was invented. This is what people were listening to at the time, around
This
about
is why they look
1830.
so sad.
This is this is a rave of the day. This is a night out. Yeah, pretty grim, right? So it's enough. It's dreadful, isn't it?
Dull, dull,
Who wrote that? It
dull.
was Marlowe, wasn't it? He must have been a laugh a minute. So, so the thing with it was that Adolf Sax had this idea. He wanted to take a brass instrument and put a woodwind mouthpiece on it and blow down it, which had never been done before. So his dad was Charles Sax, who had invented loads of things, including the tuba, the euphonium, a few other things. So when young Adolf came up with this idea, his dad just basically ridiculed it and said it'll never work, you'll never make anything of it, it's impossible. But he did. He did. Adolf worked tirelessly, spent every single penny he had to develop this saxophone. And in 1846, at the age of 32, he unveiled his first saxophone. But because he had lost all his money spending every single penny on it, bits fell off when he unveiled it at the Paris exhibition. And the next day, the press had a field day, taking Mickey, drawing silly cartoons of this ridiculous instrument. And needless to say, he was pretty crushed. So, our first tune, This All Works, it'd be an absolute miracle. So, in 1886, a little bit later, Camille Saint-Saëns wrote, very good, well done, very good, slick, wrote The Carnival of the Animals, and one of the movements was the swan. So he actually wrote it for cello, okay? But he was heard later to say, I wish I'd written it for the sax, because it's so much cooler.
Yes.
So, I mean, I'm paraphrasing.
So
but
did Anna Pavlova. as
something
well.
like that, yeah. So I'm going to play you a bit of the swan. The idea tonight, by the way, is to show you the progress of the saxophone through the ages. So from 1846, almost to present day. So, see a bit of the swan.
waken ourselves out of that reverie. I think you'll agree it sounds beautiful, even a classical piece of music being played by saxophone, which you probably haven't heard very often, so what a treat for you. So now I'm going to vamp things up a little bit in my way, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about the seductive highlights of fashion as we move through the ages, along with the evolving of the saxophone and music as well. So I liked this quote: "To seduce is to render weak," by Jean Baudrillard, which I think both fashion and music has the power to seduce. I'm sure you will agree. So throughout the history of fashion and what we choose to adorn our bodies in, women have skilled themselves in the art of seduction as one of the many routes to feminine power, creating an uncompromisingly erotic presence within lingerie, feathers, silks and laces, whether via the boudoirs of the Belle Epoque woman or on the catwalk of the later 20th century. Fashion has played a prevalent part in setting the stage for setting the tone, well done me, might work, but you know what I mean, and atmosphere for seduction, as has music. Moving on. In the 1840s, as you will see by these images, women's fashion was very cumbersome, heavy and restrictive. They were laden down with large crinolines, hoops, many layers of underskirts, garments, bustles, cloaks and bonnets, not particularly sensual. But luckily now the saxophone has been invented, things begin to get a lot sexier. So historically, temptresses have used clothing to create the expectation of delight. And they knew they had the power to do this, as men responded so beautifully just to the idea of sex. Hence why, by revealing and concealing certain parts of the female body, women had the power to lure, fascinate, and excite. And I have got a question here. You are so welcome to get a little bit interactive. Which period of fashion, because you've got a little chart here of some images representing the various decades, which period of fashion or article of clothing do you most associate or do you find the most seductive or erotic? Does anyone have?
1980s for women.
1980s, that's a very good one. Yes, I like that. Yes. And that was so easy to set up on this
1980s for
slideshow
men,
as well.
the mullets, you know,
Oh, yeah, we have to forget those.
pink
Absolutely.
singlets and
Unless that's what you like.
stubby shorts, you know, classic
I think
times.
the 1910s are really
I
cool.
love the
1910s
1910s too. Yes, I agree. Yes,
1960s
does.
for me.
1960s.
1960s
Skirts. Yes.
Bushy
Yes.
verses.
1700s. I love this. It's going to be such a wide variety. It just goes to show how subjective the theme of what people find. Yes, exactly. I mean, we all
The Gibson Girl.
Yes.
50.
Okay. Well, we're going to be touching on most of these, so yes, we shall continue. And I had a little quote here. Hers is the first move she has to track and ensnared the nail by looking seductive. She exerts her powers by way of artificial plumage. To prevent the male from escaping, she has to keep him perpetually excited by changing her shape and colours by every means fair and foul. In the traditional battle of the sexes, dress and its accessory arts are her offensive weapons. So now we shall start to move through the decades from the 1890s up to, I stopped at the 1990s, there really wasn't much going on after that. I'm sure you'll agree.
There's only so much you can do with the tracksuit.
Yes, exactly.
Amen.
And the many varying tastes, as we've all just heard with our varying opinions on what is seen as sexy, how fashions were transformed and reverted back to other styles and how they evolved over time. So later on in the 1800s, the old rigid society mould was visibly breaking up that stuffy Victorian style was beginning to dissipate, and the younger women were able to loosen up a little bit in sports-led costumes, because sports for women were becoming a little more acceptable, and their dress became visibly simpler. In 1892, the dramatic protruding bustle had completely disappeared, and the silhouette was associated with the 1890s, took hold, which was that classic S shape during the Edwardian period, designed as a healthier alternative. These new corsets did focus quite heavily on, let's say, highlighting, emphasizing all of the most erogenous zones of a woman's body, pushing the breasts forward, nipping the waist in, and pushing the bottom out. So even though skirt and dress lengths were still grazing the floor, thereby still concealing those wicked ankles, and the necklines were high, but you can begin to see the shape of woman is beginning to evolve into this much more sexualized image. And here we have the undergarments that created the S-curve. You have probably one of the first padded bras, and then this padded little bustle at the bottom to enlarge your bottom, therefore creating this effect on the end. The boudoir look in the 1890s, the tea dress became very fashionable for a woman to wear while at home only. She was not to be seen outside the home in these very louche and more undone garments, that she would receive her friends in to take tea with her in the parlour, or perhaps her lovers within the boudoir. So although seemingly fussy and covered up to the modern day eye, these more languorous robes, or wrappers as they were sometimes called, lent the viewer the possibility of a delicious package to be unwrapped in all of their lascivious laciness. And so to today's viewer, we must imagine the erotic value a woman more undone in her frilly wrappers exuded. And if you were lucky enough, you might even see a flash of those ankles as she uncrossed and crossed her legs.
Cool, blimey.
Yes. Exactly.
Is that what they were called, the naughty 90s?
The naughty 90s. Yes, exactly. Yes, I like that. A sweet disorder in the dress kindles in clothes of wantonness. Towards the end of the 1800s, I'm sure you are all aware that the can-can became one of the most saucy dances to have ever been performed. Again, many skirts, many ruffles, possibly might seem a little less exciting to what we might be able to enjoy on the stages today, but apparently the drawers were actually open at the crotch. So you can imagine a lady in the late 1800s kicking her legs up high was absolutely the most outrageous thing ever.
I think that's my cue line, isn't
That's
it?
your cue line?
So I've got various lines here to tell me that it's my turn to play, and the one for that was open crotch drawers. So I've been eagerly waiting for open crotch drawers.
You've got some good cues.
I used to play for the Queen. What happened? It's all going so well.
I know, I'm dragging you down.
So the can-can, I'm going to keep this piece quite brief. I've got the whole thing. Obviously, I can play it. But the reason I'm keeping it brief is, one, in the interest of this not being 3.5 hours long, and B, it's really hard. So I'm going to play the can-can. So if you didn't know, the can-can's from Orpheus in the Underworld by Offenbach, and this is the last scene where all the gods are going mental basically on stage and getting drunk and cavorting around. That's what it originally was anyway. Bear with. So, okay, it's always the IT that lets you down. The playing is the easy bit. Okay. Okay, it's quite quiet. It's not for that.
I wanted to say one thing, and my brain wasn't working fast enough, but basic instinct.
Yeah.
Yes.
The amount, your can thing about a little bit of something which might or might not
Be
have
revealed.
appeared
Yes.
across the stage,
Yeah.
smoky,
It's
up
really revealed
there,
here.
it may or may not. The amount of time that was spent watching and re-watching Sharon Stone uncrossing her
There
legs
you go,
to see if or if not this thing hasn't changed.
Truth that concealed with the possibility of a reveal is the most exciting.
And nobody cared that whether she was naked or not. People just wanted to know, did I glimpse the thing that I might have glimpsed? And actually, yeah.
Yes.
Speak for yourself, Phil Beast.
Nobody.
And actually,
Nobody.
for those of the other persuasion, Carrington, the bed scene, I'm pretty sure it's no, it's another movie. There was another movie where actually the accidental exposure of a male piece
Member. Yes.
through his pajamas in a pre-code movie was another big thing that happened. So it probably somewhere between the can and the basic instinct, there was a pre-code movie where a man's part. Yes, you saw it.
Which film
I
is
sent
that?
it
You'll
to
have
you.
to message that to me.
This is escalating quite quickly.
We'll put it on the. I'm sure Clayton will put it on the
Moving
next
on, moving on.
newsletter.
Cut that bit out.
So, we're moving into the 20th century with the fashions of the 1900s, my absolute favourite. Early 1900s. And I've written here about the British dressmaker Lucille. I love the story of her collections, which she named Gowns of Emotion, which I think is so apt because clothing, really does, if styled well and thought is put into it, it really does arouse an emotion. And I just thought that was such a beautiful way to describe a fashion collection. Had the titles that were bound to inspire passionate response, such as "The sighing sounds of lips unsatisfied," and "When passion's thrall is o'er." Yes.
I read that as ooh.
Ooh, ah. Yes.
It's a lot about you.
Houses
Oh, dear.
of London, it could be, yes. Why not? With descriptions of gowns such as a soft grey chiffon veiling, an underdress of short pink and violet taffeta. It is enough to make even those averse to fashion emit a sigh and a swoon. And to me, this is fashion porn indeed.
Blimey, it's hot in here, isn't it? I thought I was going to play a few nice tunes. This is going a whole different direction. So, in around about this time, sort of 1910, Irving Berlin, was one of many. Sorry, Berlin. I do apologise. Probably doesn't really matter. Had a stab at writing jazz. So a lot of people who wanted to cash in on this new. And in 1910, it was brand spanking new. Jazz had never really been heard anywhere apart from, say, New Orleans. So a lot of middle class white guys try to cash in by writing a jazz tune and hopefully making millions of pounds. It didn't quite go that way. Alexander's Ragtime Band was very popular only because later on competent bands, shall we say, played it. If you ever hear, and you can find this on YouTube, an early recording of Irving Berlin's actual band playing it, it's nothing like we would recognise it. That's a theme that carries on throughout the life of the saxophone. So I'm going to play you a little bit, even though it's dreadful.
Not your playing band.
It's very staid. We wouldn't really call it jazz as such, but we'll see how that progresses through the years.
It's ragtime, isn't it?
It's ragtime, but it's not even that really. It's very
Scott
square.
Joplin and that.
Exactly. It's very
There's
square.
that song about the ragtime infantry, you know, they're going to biff the Kaiser and that, you know, so that was the music of the Great War.
Yeah.
And of course, I think it's ideal that that piece is a little more staid than the jazz that we came to know in the next decade, because the fashion for hobble skirts occurred, and a hobble skirt was a skirt that narrowed so severely towards the ankles that it impeded the wearer's stride, and they had no choice but to hobble and mince with very small steps, which to men in the early 1900s, I'm sure was absolutely irresistible. Probably made her bottom wiggle as well. They were a short-lived fashion that peaked between 1908 and 1914. He looks very happy with himself. And at the bottom of this picture, I don't know if you can see, it says the hobble skirt. What's that? It's the speed limit skirt. And the next time that we would see a skirt emulating or just significantly impeding how a woman would walk and move was to be in the 1950s with the aptly named wiggle skirt. Also in the 1910s, you had the liberation from that still very heavily corseted S-bend silhouette. Paul Poiret came to the forefront with his very exotic Orientalism designs. Salomania, inspired by Oscar Wilde's Salome, was it just took over all of Europe, who were absolutely intoxicated and obsessed with the exoticism of the Orient. And there were many 1001 Nights themed parties. So the shape became looser, easier to wear, more free and liberated for women. Tunics, harem trousers to represent that Orientalist look, turbans, very much also inspired by the Ballet Russe, who were really at the helm of the arts and ballet at that time. And it was the perfect time for Art Nouveau femme fatales as well, definitely inspired by a lot of the literature that was very fashionable at that time. And Tim is going to be playing you very soon a piece that you'll all know very well. You'll probably most associate it with two very well-known ice skaters. But the story is actually that, surprise, Ravel did not write it for Torben Dean. He was asked by the Ballet Russe star Ida Rubinstein to compose a piece of music for her. And so Bolero was born, and Ida Rubinstein, who is here, was a very tall, slim and slinky figure. She was very ethereal and exotic looking. And when you listen to this, I hope that instead of envisioning Torvald Dean whizzing around that ice skating rink over and over again, you perhaps might be able to imagine the long and sinuous body of Ida Rubinstein slinking along to the strains of the repetitive but hypnotic phrases. And the costumes were designed by Leon Bakst, who again brought Orientalism to the forefront of fashion with his very fantastical and exotic designs.
Well done.
Okay.
So,
Thank you.
yeah, so in the world of the saxophone, things were picking up a pace. Production had stepped up. There was more interest because composers were starting to incorporate it into their works, including Bizet and Debussy, and this, which is Bolero. Ravel actually hated it. He only wrote it because he was commissioned to do so. He ended up absolutely hating it because of all the works he wrote, some of which were actually very credible. He got known for this, and every time he did a concert, he was asked to play it, and he ended up absolutely hating it. It's not exactly one of my favourites because it goes on for 14 minutes. So if you've ever played anything for 14 minutes, you end up, after a few performances of it, feeling similarly to Ravel. But here's a bit of Ravel's Bolero. So that was actually one of the first times that saxophones have been, two of them, have been played in the same piece. So if you ever hear this again on Classic FM, which they play every sort of 12 minutes.
When they need a loo break and a lunch hour.
Yeah, I swear they've got like 3 CDs, Classic FM. But anyway, when you do hear this again, have a listen, because every now and again you can hear the soprano and the tenor saxophone playing together, which had never been done before, apart from in dance music, obviously. But in classical music, that had never been done, which sort of, you know, separates it from other pieces.
Yes. Beautiful. I love that. I didn't used to love it so much, but I think when you have the imagery is such a powerful thing of, you know, whatever image you last had of, you know, that is
Ice skaters.
which is ice skaters, Torvald Dean, exactly. But you can really reframe that when you actually know the story, and it was written for somebody who was a lot more exciting and exotic to watch than Torvald Dean. Anyway, 1920s, here we are. The period following on from the First World War left those still alive with a new vivacity and drive to celebrate life. Jazz was born, and with it the desire to live life to the fullest and move even further away from the restrictive and stuffier fashions that had come before. Dresses were shortened to the high calf, or even more shockingly above the knee, so that women could shimmy more easily to the strains of the jazz bands playing the Charleston. Disgusting the older generations of the left from the Victorian and Edwardian ways, they despised the flappers and bright young things whose carefree debauchery and desire to live fast and bear it all were often featured in the newspapers, scandalising the nations, as did the music, which took on a much livelier feel.
Yeah, so in saxophone world, people were trying to jump on the bandwagon. Obviously, everyone knows about the racial tensions at the time. What generally happened was that black people would write this incredible music, white people would try and play it, didn't do very well, so the black people, musicians, tried to make it more and more difficult. So this is just before that happens. Other things like bebop, which was written by some virtuoso saxophonists, thinking that the white people could play it, so that they would get the money, they would get the sales, and of course it didn't quite work like that. So this is where the saxophone really hit its boom period. So the 20s were massive for the saxophone. Everybody wanted to play one. You had whole families buying one each and starting to play them, and would all sit around the piano playing them. It's hard to imagine that now, but it actually did happen. The only other example of that is when guitars took off in the 1960s. But this was the boom period for the saxophone, and this was one of the most popular tunes for people to learn for obvious reasons, because they could play it and everyone could dance to it.
I just imagine you're really wanting to. Anyway, so during the 20s, legs were at the height of erotic interest. With high hemlines, legs came decorated with stockings, ribbons, and rouged knees.
Painted knee.
Indeed. The chest was out of fashion, as the most seductive shape of woman during this period was a straighter, more androgynous shape. Next enjoyed later in the 1960s and again in the 1990s. This was the perfect figure for showing off straighter drop waist dresses and slinky beach pajamas. Totally accepted. Expecting that, Lindsay. The female body was now more in view than ever before, with shock horror bare armpits. Had the seductive mystery of a woman's body suddenly vanished with the banishing of layers and fripperies? Well, for some who enjoyed the Edwardian fashions, maybe that's the case. Maybe it's just too out there and too obvious. Who knows? Shocking. Absolutely shocking. Right, we're moving on to the 1930s.
So this is another example of a middle-aged white guy trying to cash in my opinion. So George Gershwin wrote Porgy and Bess around this time, and it's a cheery story if you don't know it. So it's the story of a disabled black beggar, Porgy, and a girl, Bess, who he is trying to rescue from a drug dealer and violent lover. So laughs all round. So this tune comes from the opera, which is, I think everyone knows, Summertime. So yeah, this is Summertime. Yeah, cheers.
into the slinky 30s, the woman's body was now much more celebrated and brought to the forefront of on the silver screen, with stars like Jean Harlow slinking onto the movie sets of Hollywood in dresses designed by the likes of Adrian. And these dresses were very often inspired by the Parisian couturier Madeleine Vionnet, who worked with a lot of draping and bias cut gowns that were cut on the round to cling to the curves of a woman's body, and they were often using the nudist of shades to whites, ivories, silks and satins to really cling to the body and give that effect of nudity. There was also very much a Grecian inspiration to these gowns. They were twisted and wrapped and draped around the natural form of the female body, and they were really freeing them within movement and expression.
Very good. Yeah. So the piece I'm going to play for this period is Harlem Nocturne, which, although it was written around now, was obviously a lot of people will know used for Mike Hammer in the 60s, which was a detective series, which was very popular. And it had a little bit of renaissance at that period, because people heard this music and thought they want to play it. So it did have a little bit of renaissance then. Yeah, okay, so I'll just play,
yes,
play a
I
bit
love
of
this.
Yeah,
You're going to love
this
this.
is one of the better ones, because it's actually written for the instrument.
It's
which
very
does make a bit of
slinky,
difference. Yeah.
sexy, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's great. Play on, Dan. And if we're going to talk about the more erogenous zones as expressed via clothes and interest, the legs were it. They were probably one of the only things that they could flash at those times, being that obviously clothing was not high priority during the wartime, but they did ensure that they maintained the effect of the nylon stockings, even though they couldn't get hold of them during the rationing period. So they took to priming their legs with makeup and drawing a line up from the heel of the foot towards the thigh with a pencil. Hair and makeup, i.e. the famous 40s red lipstick, embraces a way of maintaining feminine dignity, strength, and giving the proverbial finger up to the devastating effects that Germany's invasions were having on the world. And so we've got a picture here of two friends drawing lines up each other's legs. And I like this poster here, packing food for the boys or meeting him on leave with Pond's lips and Pond's dream flower powder. And it was, really just representing the fact that it was important to keep up appearances and to welcome the boys back home looking as best as you could. Over in Hollywood, meanwhile, the famed aviator and inventor Howard Hughes created the first prototype of the push-up blow-up bra for Jane Russell in the 1943 film The Outlaw, on which he was directing at the time, taking full advantage of the knowledge that sex sells. Howard saw the importance in emphasizing Jane's biggest assets, causing a furore with Hollywood censors, and they weren't actually allowed to release that on the screen until later in 1950 because the sight of Jane Russell's busts, bosoms, talent, assets, whatever you want to say, yes, blown up, was just too much for the censors to bear. So when it was released in 1950, at a most pivotal moment when Jane leans over the wounded Billy the Kid, an audience member was heard to shout, "Bombs away!"
Yeah, well done. So, as we all know, the Second World War gave rise to all sorts of exciting new music. The biggest, of course, was big band music that suddenly took hold because people wanted to take their mind off the war and dance and be happy. There are countless tunes I could have played with this, but I think this is one that's not played as much as In the Mood and American Patrol. So, a little bit of Moonlight Serenade.
We have to whiz into the 1950s now. What's happened to my S? It's slipped. Very excited. It was a more joyous time for women's fashions as we came out of the end of the war. The film industry was also booming, helping the world get over the catastrophe of it all, and in came the hourglass bombshell. So stars such as Sophia Loren and Jane Mansfield wiggled onto the cinema screens, poured into dresses that accentuated the preferred silhouette of the 1950s. That beautiful shapely hourglass, perfectly represented by Marilyn Monroe, of course. And there's this great quote by somebody who witnessed her at an event. Marilyn hove into view 2 hours late because her dress was tight around her knees. She walked with mincing steps which emphasized the rotation of her hips. Her curves shimmered in the golden dress. Breaths were drawn in. Gasps of horror and admiration filled the room. The topic on everyone's lips was Marilyn Monroe. And women celebrated their newfound femininity after the rigorous rationing of the war, and the stereotypical Stepford wife saw the home as the ultimate place of seduction. And props including the Merry Widow corsets, bullet bras, stockings, tight sweaters, tight skirts, and high heels ensured that they maintained their own subtle sense of feminine aggression. So even though by today's standards we might not think of the 50s housewife as an empowered figure, to many of them it was a way of asserting their own feminine sexual power. Debate after, if you like. The wiggle skirt emulated the same idea that we discussed in the hobble skirt, clasping the woman's legs closer together to inspire a small stepped wiggle, like walk, accentuating attention on the bottom. But for those who like to get involved with the swing and rock and roll dance and music movement of the time, flared A-line skirts made it easier to swish and twirl in. My S has dropped again.
So the end of the war, not too much. So the end of the war heralded lots of brand new music coming in, and one of them was bebop. So it was called bebop, in case anyone doesn't know, because people like Charlie Parker, who was probably the greatest saxophonist who ever lived, pretty much between him, Dizzy Gillespie, and a few others up for debate, invented this style of playing, the articulation in the notes basically emulating the sound bebop. So this is a really good example. This is actually, believe it or not, written in 1946. I thought this was later because it's actually quite sophisticated, but believe it or not, it's actually 1946.
50s piece.
Sorry?
Yes.
It does sound like a 50s piece, yeah, you would think it was, but it's actually 46. So there you go.
Yeah, but don't tell them now because that...
Sorry, I've got one more actually for the 50s. Should we do that one now?
Oh yeah, right,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah.
Let me just do the 50s one, then we can move on to the 60s, which is where things went seriously wrong. I mean, guitars. So, so this was this. I'm just going to play a little bit of this because I'm aware of the time, but it's worth mentioning that in 1959, really into the 60s, cool jazz hit the UK. It had been going on sort of the east coast of America for a few years. Dave Brubeck led the charge and basically brought a brand new, fresh, cool sound to the UK. This is take 5. It was actually not written by Dave Brubeck, it was written by Paul Desmond, who's a saxophonist. And believe it or not, Paul Desmond was a classical saxophone player first. Learned his incredible technique through that, and this was based on a warm-up exercise, believe it or not, that he actually used to warm up. When Dave Brubeck heard it and went, "What's that?" And it became their biggest hit.
So we're not swinging into the 60s yet, we're slinking into the 60s with my favourite version of 60s fashion. And we're looking at the renaissance of the Art Nouveau and the 30s femme fatale as brought about by Bieber, whose collections included very slinky satin and silky bias cut dresses, veiled hats and stacked heels. It's worn by Twiggy here as she lays across an animal skin, and there was a lot of Art Deco influence in Bieber's Barber Anarchy's designs. Seductive Deco decadence reigned again for a short time before Bieber's demise, which is very sad, but as you see here, it also followed through into makeup, and she took a lot of she was very influenced by the looks of the earlier 1900s vamps, Theda Bara. So she's trying to emulate the looks of the eyes with the makeup that she produced.
An Egyptian.
Yes. Indeed. Theda Bara and Greta Garbo. So yeah, she was very influenced by the vamps and the femme fatales from early on 1920s, 1930s. But then there was also obviously the movement of fashion that we most identify with 1960s, with the birth of the miniskirt. Legs became the epitome of excitement. And again, like the 1920s, the slim, more androgynous look was more in fashion, and bare limbs joyously go-go danced in free abandon.
Nearly there. Okay, so we're zipping through the decades. So, yeah. The 60s is a dark period in the saxophone. So basically what happened...
Wilderness years.
Yeah, everyone took the guitar on, became obsessed with guitar, and the saxophone was reduced to being a backing instrument, which was horrific. This is a really good example of how, bearing in mind, only 10 years before we were hearing things like Take 5 and bebop and all that kind of stuff. This is what happened next. I feel good. I feel good. So good. So good. I got to use Yeah, this one, yeah.
I see it as a dialogue.
A dialogue, yeah, okay. Yeah, maybe. That's a nice way of putting it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Two instruments, yeah. I like it.
Are we moving on?
We're moving on. We're moving on to the 70s, when disco blew onto the scene, and hot pants and platform shoes were de rigueur in the nightclub. The sexual revolution was in full swing, and no part of the woman's body was off limits to flaunt and celebrate whilst gyrating in Studio 54. So in the 1970s, these very languorous jersey cut dresses, cut-out shapes, low V necklines, high slashed at the thigh, very much Halston's signature. But harking back to the 30s and Madame Grey's Grecian shapes as well. And Halston was really seen as the modern day architect of the body. So he was working with that jersey, slashing and draping it over the female form to form very provocative and eye-catching lyrics. Not sure what happened there. Slinky shapes. Slinky shapes. Slinky shapes. Oh, and here's something for the ladies, because all of you gents have been getting these photos. So I found out that there's some fellow called Tim Capello, who was the sexy sax man of the 1980s. Oh, 70s actually, I think it was, yeah. We're still in the 70s. Ignore that. Bodybuilder, famously playing topless on tour with Tina Turner and Peter Gabriel. So enjoy, ladies. And you don't have to take your top off.
Okay, moving on. So the 70s was, there's a few things being written, but most of them are rubbish, like Baker Street now, and I'm not playing that for any money in the world. So
yes, you will for money.
well, yeah. Nice, my agent. So moving on. So I've chosen. I couldn't find many pieces for saxophone that are actually any good for the 70s. Most of them are absolutely dreadful. But this one I think is probably the best one. So this is a bit of jazz fusion for you. Quite a long intro, so feel free to talk amongst yourselves.
Really long.
Bring a book or something.
I should go make tea when you're rehearsing.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Still quite a way to go, but it's worth it in the end.
Are we there yet?
Yeah, we're here now. Remember the name of that band? No, it
Had
wasn't.
anyone ever
actually.
heard that before? Because I
Yeah.
Yes.
It was actually Spyro Gyra.
Oh no, my S has dropped again. Right, okay. I'm going to have a word with those S's later. So, 1980s, punk fashion subverted the idea of subtle female coercion by taking on a fierce and more overt tribal strength and stance when it came to feminine sexuality. Fishnets, killer heels, and leather communicated sexuality as a symbol of female autonomy, with the suggestion that women were prepared to bludgeon men into submission and eat them for breakfast. Women were taking more charge of their sexuality than ever and dressing up for themselves more than to please a man. Obviously, yes, the most obvious icon of the 1980s was Madonna, who stormed the stages and the bedroom walls of boys and girls, I'm sure. Her raw and youthful sexuality represented by basques, lace gloves and rah-rah skirts. She was the 80s version of Marilyn Monroe, inspiring teenagers world over to dress to express. And here she is wearing one of the famous Jean-Paul Gaultier conical bra corsets that both she and Jean-Paul Gaultier became very famous for. Back in the 80s.
Okay, so again, quite thin on the ground for sax pieces for the 80s. So what I've done is a bit cheeky. I've chosen a piece that was actually written for the sax. Stop me if you know it. It's written for a detective series. Minor arpeggio in reposition with a chromatic approach note on the mediant and an embellished ninth note triplet mordant. So anyone, why is it no? Okay, it is of course Poirot.
So this is our last decade because really, as we said, fashion and music really go downhill after this decade. And here we've got, this is Bill Clinton, isn't it, at his, is that his inauguration?
Yeah.
Yes, he's quite the sax fan. So I think 90s gets a bit of a, I think we've already forgotten that the 90s fashion was fun, and again there was more effort made than in more recent decades. Underwear as outerwear slipped, my little joke, onto the scene. The boudoir look was now taken onto the streets, represented by slip dresses, get it, sheer blouses and corsets. So yeah, there was a real taste for this lingerie look. And as modelled here by Drew Barrymore, Amanda Cadnett and Courtney Love, they really enjoyed going out in vintage 90s and slip dresses. And also, I don't know, I'm sure you remember, they were quite often worn over t-shirts. That was a very staple 90s style as well. And of course we have Vivienne Westwood reworking historical fashion taken from the boudoirs of Madame de Pompadour, plunging corsets, hoop skirts, and the mini versions of crinoline. These are her mini crinnies here. And there's been a massive rebirth of these very Renaissance art styled corsets. You can buy them from newer brands. Again, I think Vivienne Westwood's death really sort of revived that. The love of Madame de Pompadour and Marie Antoinette and the art. I love her style and her designs still. Then we had the more overt sexuality expressed through fashion with Dolce & Gabbana, Versace and Thierry Mugler, very much inspired by BDS M-themed strapping and chains and rivets and corsets, black widow stylized creations. I love the very articulated shoulders of Thierry Mugler, again the nipped in waists and short tight skirts. So it was a more aggressive sexuality that was expressed in the 1990s. And I believe that brings us to the end.
Well, almost. It's almost time for us to say goodbye. There's a clue in that. So before we finish, I thought I'd just give a conclusion from the saxophone's point of view. So originally, the saxophone was seen as a joke. It was much maligned in the press. Debussy called it that muddy instrument. It didn't have a great start, but I think it's fair to say it's gone on to be probably one of the most successful instruments ever made. It's interesting, as a footnote, that Adolphe Sax was so devastated by the treatment he had in the press the next day, he actually killed himself. But he threw himself off a bridge, penniless and destitute, believing his life's work would never get anywhere. That was in France straight after the Paris exhibition. The French president at the time, who was called Sadi Carnot, was so embarrassed and mortified by what had happened, he ordered the press to report his death as pneumonia, and under threat of a very serious jail sentence if you printed the truth, because he was so embarrassed. It's interesting that same year, the president himself was assassinated, presumably by a saxophonist. This is the last tune I'm going to play, so this is Time to Say Goodbye. It's not written by Andrea Bocelli, as most people think. It's actually written by Francesco Sartori, but it was first performed by Andrea Bocelli at the 1995 San Remo Music Festival. I've actually been asked to play this, believe it or not, at more than 30 funerals. So make of that what you will, and thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
questions?
We got it.
Can I just say, I love the way you stood there. You looked very serene.
Oh, thank you, darling. It's very kind.
Yes, I agree. Energy. Very
As Tim took centre stage with his gorgeous music.
You both learned hard with each other. The feminine elements of this masculine.
No, we didn't communicate at all doing that, please. Kind of.
Telepathic.
How long did it take you to prepare the song?
Oh, no time at all. Yeah. Just threw it together. Yeah. We hadn't had an argument before that. No, we didn't really.
No, we didn't.
I'm joking, obviously. No, it was just, I wrote the music, Laura wrote out all the stuff, and then we just basically made sure today, this morning, that it all sort of linked up a bit, and that was
Yes,
that.
indeed.
Very nice.
No, absolutely terrific. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for coming and using that tonight. I think you can judge how well it's gone in how many empty glasses there are. People haven't been leaving. They've wanted to stay, to hear the playing, to hear the words. Thank you so much. Do you drink? Because I'm sure people would like to buy.
Yeah.
Please buy our saxophonist
do
and our
now.
speaker
We do now.
a drink so they can wet their whistles after all they've given to us here
Thank you.
tonight.
Thank you.
And is there anywhere we can hear you play, or do you maybe teach funerals?
Yes.
There we go, funerals and everything. Thank you once again.
Very, very